Welcome back, everybody, to the Child Repair Guide. I'm Dr. Steve Silvestro, and my guests today are Dr. Michael Goran and Dr. Emily Ventura, co-authors of the brand new book, Sugarproof, The Hidden Dangers of Sugar That Are Putting Your Child's Health at Risk and What You Can Do. Thank you both for coming here today to talk about this important topic.
Thank you. Thank you. Such a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. You guys have each done really incredible work over the years, individually and together, to help families find balance with nutrition and help their kids get healthy. What led to the collaboration and publication of this particular book right now?
Yeah, so Emily and I have kind of a long history working together. Emily was a graduate student in my lab, did her research in my lab. Was that 20 years ago? The years are going by very quickly. And then she worked in the lab. She did some of the pivotal studies that we're probably going to talk about later as part of her graduate work. And then she moved on, pursued her own path, but we always stayed in touch. We worked on a few writing projects together. And when I decided it was time to write a book, Emily was, there was a short list of one in terms of co-authors, because Emily's just got such a great writing style. She's a recipe developer, nutrition educator, health behavior expert. So it was just a great combination. And, in terms of the timing, it was to do with a number of factors, some realizations that we can talk about in more detail of not just the fact that children today are consuming more and more sugar, but that they're consuming different types of sugar, and that sugar in particular is disrupting growth and development. So we often think of sugar as causing weight gain and tooth decay, and that's about it. But through our research and the research of others, the story came together. More sugar, different types of sugar, specifically affecting childhood development. And there was a story there on the research that I wanted to get out, but also we wanted to provide easy solutions, because it's easy enough to say, okay, we got to eat less sugar. We know that. A lot of people know that, but how do you put that into practice? So we wanted to translate the science and put it into practice as well.
Yeah, and very early on in the book, you describe a perfect storm that sets our kids up to potentially have battles with sugar. Can you walk us through that storm and describe what's going on there?
Yeah, so the perfect storm that we talk about, there's three elements of that storm. One, that sugar is just everywhere. Kids and adults are surrounded by sugar in our food environment. 70% of processed foods, 80% of snacks targeted to children, different types of sugar. But on top of that, a key factor is that babies are born with a built-in preference for sweetness. And the more that they're exposed to sweetness, the more that preference gets amplified. But this was supposed to be a protective mechanism. It wasn't supposed to be one that was played out in today's food environment. So it was supposed to optimize liking of breast milk and optimize disliking of potentially toxic foods. But now we have a very different food environment, and this protective mechanism is not only backfiring, but it's being amplified. So we're basically amping up. And then the third aspect, all of that would be okay. We're just consuming more sugar. But the third aspect is the physiological vulnerability to sugar that exists in multiple organs that are being built during growth and development that are disrupted by too much sugar. So those are the three kind of colliding factors that any one of them alone would probably be okay. but the combination is a perfect storm.
Yeah. And my wife is currently a preschool teacher. She had worked in nutrition for a number of years, and so we've often had a steady stream of nutrition books and conversations about different things that are going on or discoveries. And I find it really fascinating to think about how we got here. You talk a little bit about it in the book. I think it was maybe Mary Nestle's, one of her books, maybe Food Politics, I think was one of hers, that talked about bumper crops of corn and the U.S. government legislating essentially to encourage more corn production, which then fed on into the overabundance of high fructose corn syrup. And there's a New York Times article a couple years ago with the discovery of documents of essentially sugar companies, sugar lobbies paying high-ranking officials and influential researchers to publish research that showed that all of our health woes were due to saturated fat and not to sugar. Sugar was just bad for teeth. It sounds almost like a conspiracy theory, but these are all things that led us to here. How has that landscape of sugar availability and types of sugar changed over the last few decades?
Well, I mean, I think you just gave a good summary of it. Consumption has skyrocketed. The U.S. is the largest consumer of sugar in the world. It's flattened off a little bit in terms of overall consumption of sugar, but I think what's happening more recently is the types of sweeteners are changing. Yeah. And you mentioned high fructose corn syrup, which most people are now familiar with and aware of its potential hazards to health. But now there's over 200 different names for different types of sugars and different types of sweeteners proliferating all the time. Many of them are also high fructose based. They're not called high fructose corn syrup, so we might not kind of associate them with problem, but fruit juice concentrates, for example, have a healthy halo around them in terms of their sound, but fruit juice concentrates of any variety are just basically concentrated fructose. They're actually higher in fructose than high fructose corn syrup. So in terms of the fructose content and the sweetness, they kind of meet many of the same criteria as high fructose corn syrup, and it turns out it's the fructose that's more problematic. And now, if you're talking about kind of how things are changing, we can get into talking about alternative sweeteners, non-caloric sweeteners. That's a whole other conversation perhaps we can talk about, but that's now also a huge emerging growing problem.
Well, maybe if we could touch on all these little bits here and there, you do mention in the book that there are, I think early on at one point you have a list of almost 80 different names for sugars, and you have this cool little challenge in the book, the Cliff Bar challenge, that says how many of these ingredients do you think are, I think it was either sugar based or maybe even fructose based. And I was amazed at this thing that I had potentially for years. I mean, those were a mainstay during med school for me. How many of the ingredients that sound like they are potentially good for you because they talk about being fruit-based are really sugar-based, and they're as a sweetener. How can parents navigate a label when there are so many different titles for different types of sugar?
Yeah. You want to take that one, Emily?
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
I mean, even, if you're rushed and you're a parent and you're at the store, even if you know what to look for, sometimes you don't even really have time to scan it properly. So, that list of 80 that we have in the book is actually just an abbreviated list of the 200 plus names that you can find on the fuller list that's online. And it is hard, but, we don't expect that parents would be memorizing any of that. It's just, more about looking at the grams of added sugar that now should be displayed on the food label and giving a quick scan of the ingredient list for some of the usual culprits that now are often healthy sounding, like fruit juice concentrates. And then also, because there are so many low-calorie sweeteners used, the food label where it gives the total and added sugars doesn't tell the full story. So you do need to also be aware that, might say no added sugars, but it might have, stevia or monk fruit or, something like aspartame in the product, and sometimes multiple ones. So yeah, I mean, it's tricky. And, as parents, we all sometimes bring something home that we thought was better than it actually was. And that's okay. It's just a matter of kind of figuring out what can be staples in your house, and then ultimately shifting away from some of these products and shifting more toward easy things that you can be making at home that don't have a food label because you made them and they're not that hard, or your kids can help make them. Shifting away from products in general usually is one of the easiest things to avoid, to be sure you're avoiding some of these things that are hiding.
Yeah. Because as you mentioned in the book, whole fruit and whole foods, I mean, I think a lot of us have really started to hear these words abundantly now over the last several years. Right. And you point out in the book that grains have glucose and fruit has fructose, but because of the natural packaging with the other nutritional components there, we handle those better, right? Are there, out of this long list of different types of sugars, what would you say should be ones that parents should really hone in on as ones to steer more away from, or ones that, if we were going to have some added sugar and something we're going to bring home, might be more okay? You mentioned like trehalose can potentially lead to C. diff infection, and there are some that I gather are sort of the big supervillains, and others, if we had to have a gray zone, might be more in that zone.
Mm-hmm. I mean, definitely, high fructose corn syrup, although that's starting to be used less and less. But, things like fruit juice concentrates or fruit sugars, crystalline fructose, things like that are definitely ones to look out for. Agave syrup is really high in fructose as well. Any of the low-calorie sweeteners, we're just not comfortable recommending because we don't know the long-term effects. And we do know that they ramp up the sweet taste preference because they're so much sweeter than regular sugars. Yeah. So we're not comfortable recommending those for children, and we recommend that parents try and avoid those.
Can you talk about that ramping up of the sweet taste preference? Delve into that for a minute. Yeah.
Yes. I think, Michael, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, so like I mentioned, from an evolutionary perspective, we're born with this built-in preference for sweetness. But studies have shown that even if the fetus is exposed to too much sugar, or if the baby or the infant or the child, the more they're exposed to sugar, the more you ramp up that built-in preference. So, the standard test that people do is they create 5 solutions, let's say, of lemonade. In fact, we walk you through this test in the book. You can do it at home. And my kid's done it in her school, and you can show this in your family too. Make 5 concentrations of, let's say, lemonade or apple juice, from the most concentrated form that you buy in the store down to a very diluted form, let's say 25%. And then you taste them in a random order, and you decide which one you prefer the most. And kids will always go for the sweetest variety. And adults will be perfectly fine with the lower sweet versions. And Michael Moss has written about this in his book, Salt, Sugar, Fat. It's called The Bliss Point. And food companies are aware of this higher preference for sweetness. And they know that the more sugar and sweetness they pack into something, the more kids will like it and get hooked on it. And the more exposure that kids are getting to these sweetened products, the more they want sweetness. It's almost like we're amplifying the craving or the addiction to sweetness. And that is a natural element of being a child. But like I said, it's kind of backfiring in today's high sweet food environment. But the good news is, the same way that it's ramped up, you can ramp it down too. And that's kind of a basic aspect of Sugarproof, is that if you dial back on sugar consumption, you can dial back this craving for sweetness and basically adjust your palates and your kids' palates back to more reasonable levels of liking. And what's happened is this huge amplification of liking sweetness has just kind of swamped our taste buds, and we no longer are enjoying sweet treats. It's just kind of become part of every meal, has become a sweet treat. So if we can dial it back on everyday staples, then I think it leaves room to enjoy sweet treats and have them be a special moment.
Yeah.
Because we're not saying we shouldn't eat any sugar or enjoy any sweet treats, because we all love sweet treats, and it's an important part of being a kid, and it's an important part of enjoying food. But we've kind of lost sight of that because of this ramping up of sweetness.
Yeah. Yeah, you tell stories in the book about remembering like ice cream trucks and that sort of thing. I mean, I think we all have that experience, right? And we've got these emotional attachments, but when it becomes so readily available and all the time, that's where we get a problem. And I do absolutely want to go through some tips that parents can use to try and sugar-proof their homes and their families. But maybe before we dig into it, just like you do in the book, we should talk about why this is such a big deal. Because, we, like you said just a few minutes back, we've gotten so much of the message that sugar is bad for our teeth, and now that it's leading to maybe obesity and potentially diabetes, but you detail so many other major impacts that are hidden impacts, subtle impacts, that are subtle at least until they really present themselves. What would you say are some of the biggest downsides to this overabundance of access to sugar?
Yeah, well, so excess sugar can be affecting kids' bodies literally from head to toe, whether that's brain development or more immediate effects on mood and temperament and behavior, kind of acute effects. But at the level of the brain, that could also impair memory, and studies have shown impairments in academic test performance as well. And through the body really can affect most parts of the body, can be affected, whether that's the liver for fatty liver disease, which is a non-existent disease 20 years ago, certainly non-existent in children. It used to be associated with alcohol. Now it's associated with sugar and fructose in particular. Diabetes, of course, cardiovascular disease, kind of the long-term chronic diseases, which are silently and slowly progressing without symptoms in children, but the evolution and the development of those diseases starts early in life and is associated with too much sugar. And then there's the inflammatory conditions like asthma, acne, and even inflammation of the joints like in gout. These also have been associated with sugar, digestive issues, tummy problems. There's lots of different ways that developing organs of the body are affected by sugar. And, tooth decay is obvious because it's very tangible. You can see it and it becomes very obvious. But it's a good example of how a tooth, which is a developing organ, is vulnerable to sugar because sugar promotes bacterial growth. Those bacteria produce acid. The reason that developing teeth are vulnerable is because they haven't fully developed their enamel structure. And so those teeth aren't protected Well, that's just a very tangible example, but the same is happening in the brain or the pancreas or the liver. It's being developed and may not be fully functional yet to handle all the sugar, or it might be disrupted by excess sugar.
Yeah, you you mentioned in the book about how kids are exposed potentially early on, even through breast milk and formula, and yet with fructose in particular, babies and children haven't really developed the means to handle that as well. And so does that just compound the effect compared to what it might do to an adult? Would you potentially see then that a family would have that these things may be impacting kids more so than adults, whether the adults are aware of that or not?
Yeah, I think there's multiple examples where we can make a case that the effects are compounded. First of all, they're longer lasting, earlier onset of some of these conditions that we talked about, but also things that are unique to kids. Another example would be, in terms of fructose, would be fructose malabsorption or sugar malabsorption.
Mm-hmm.
So babies aren't even born with the metabolic machinery to absorb fructose, because babies weren't expected to be exposed to fructose. So what's happening there is that if babies or infants or young children are consuming too much sugar, they're going to have digestive issues because the sugar is not absorbed. So there's one classic study, for example, of children with unexplained tummy problems. Were given a test for fructose malabsorption, and it turned out that the majority of those kids had fructose malabsorption, and that was the cause of the tummy problems. And then when you went off sugar, the tummy problems went away. So at the beginning stages, there's a separate issue to do with being an infant or a kid, that you're not yet ready to handle the sugar. But then as kids evolve and start being able to absorb the fructose, then they're exposed to the same issues as adults. But because these diseases are cumulative, there's just longer accumulation time because exposure starts younger.
Yeah.
And so these things are slowly accumulating over time, starting early.
Also, another thing that's interesting is that many parents think, oh, well, my child's not overweight, my child's very active, we actually don't eat that much sugar. But what they don't realize is that their kids are so used to a higher sugar diet, and the parents are so used to how their children are temperament-wise that that connection isn't being made. So we asked the question, do you really know what your child is like without sugar? And so when some of our families try this challenge and take it away, they start to see big improvements in mood and ability to concentrate, and just overall almost character. Just like some parents say, wow, I didn't realize how much sugar was impacting how my child was acting and how my child was feeling.
Yeah.
So I took it away.
Because there is also almost the scientific institutional argument that has been made. You do touch on in the book that a lot of us think that obviously if our kids go to a birthday party and get all wound up because they've got cake and they have candy from goodie bags and something, maybe it's the sugar. But there has been this argument by some in medicine and related fields that, oh no, it's not the sugar, it's actually just the environment, because they're amped up because they're with friends and in this fun place, a bounce house and jumping all over the place. But you make the case that that's not actually true. It really is just like we felt an impact of the sugar. Yeah.
Yeah. So
some of the previous studies that were done weren't very well controlled, and they used low-calorie sweeteners as a control, or they measured very diverse groups of children that already had some behavioral problems or even genetic conditions. So it's some of the research that informed those conclusions is now outdated. And also, it's tricky because, what you eat, it doesn't always impact you the same way on the same day. There's a lot of factors at play. Some of it might be what else your child has along with the cake at the birthday party. If your child is just also eating some pizza and then has the cake, that effect might not be as pronounced. Sometimes one child reacts more to sugar than another. So the same things aren't always true, depending on the day or the child.
Yeah. Yeah, because you think about a typical birthday party, at least, I don't know, maybe from when we were growing up, or between us and our kids, that generation there, juice and soda with the cake, and everything is just loaded right up front.
Right. Yeah. And I'm certainly not saying, that kids shouldn't be able to have birthday cake at a birthday party.
Sure.
So just to be clear on that,
Yeah. Well, that actually, let's talk about that, because, we can talk doom and gloom for a long time about all the possible really serious negative consequences of prolonged sugar exposure. But, how can parents, as you say, sugar-proof their kids without necessarily doing it in a way that makes kids and families feel like they're miserable, that they are completely missing out on everything that a kid should experience?
Well, our approach really is to bring the kids in on the process as early as possible. So it's not a top-down thing, but it's more of, the child and parent together on it, and eventually raising your children so that they're self-aware enough to where when you're not around, eventually they're making their own decisions that are healthy. So, when they're very, very young, or even, when you're pregnant, just making choices for exposure, not having a lot of, fructose or extra sugar when you're pregnant. And then as you're raising your child, when they're very young, not introducing added sugars at a young age when possible. And then as your child starts to become more, interactive and involved in their own feeding, teaching them, okay, we can choose this or we can choose this. If it's at a party, would you like to have the cake or would you like to have the ice cream? Maybe not both, or, maybe not also with the juice. So I think that's something that worked really well for me with my boys, is never making them feel like they couldn't have things, but maybe just trying to help them realize that they didn't need all of those things in one event or in one setting. And once the kids feel like they have the ability to make some of their own choices, it's really helpful in, making them not feel restricted and also making them feel empowered and informed.
Yeah. A couple of things there that you said that I want to try and tease apart. You talked about introducing added sugars early on. And I think, maybe a couple of questions there. We talked about how babies and young kids don't necessarily handle fructose well, but fructose is in fruit. And I know as a pediatrician, I get asked by some parents, when I first introduced solids to the baby, some people had this theory about introducing veggies first and not fruits because fruit is sweet. And I'll be completely honest, I've said for a long time, well, that's kind of silly because breast milk is sweet, so babies know sweet early on. What do you say, based on the work that you've done, that there's any merit in saying that we hold off on fruit a little bit longer, or we do veggies first for any of these particular reasons?
Well, I mean, I can kind of tell you what I did with my own kids, which was, trying to just keep an overall balance. So my kids, we were in Italy when they were having their first foods, and I was kind of following the advice of my Italian pediatrician. So I was doing, savory foods predominantly at meal times, maybe with a little bit of fruit toward the end of the meal, which is what would mimic the eating style of a typical Italian family. So it was, if you're going to sit down to lunch, you probably, as an adult, aren't going to have fruit first. Maybe some people would, but at least That's not the convention in Italy. So I just sort of started to raise my kids to eat more similarly to how I would eat or we would eat. And then, just making choices, like if I was going to buy, a jar of baby food out of convenience, I would try and make sure that it didn't have, that it wasn't like a fruit product that also had added fruit juice concentrates in it, because there's a lot of those. Or, there's baby products that are like rice cakes that are, sprayed with fruit juice concentrates, or teething biscuits that are full of sugar, or, just trying to avoid some of those extra sugars that are really not necessary for kids when they're
or getting some variety in there. So if you if parents are using those products and you're doing just all apple concentrates or apple purees, try to mix it up a little bit. I mean, there's other fruits that are out there lower in fructose that have other benefits as well. So just use variety.
And I will ask to confirm what I tell parents. There's no real room for juice, correct? Right. I get asked a lot, more often than I would suspect nowadays, with the messages that we all hear. Maybe there's some grandparent influence a lot of times. It's when can I start giving juice? And depending on how snarky I may want to be, I might say, never, or not never, but that I think that the marketing has been so strong for so long that a lot of folks still today will look at juice and think it's a great source of vitamins, whereas the actual whole fruit, the whole food is a much better source.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not big fans of juice either. I think we just kind of accepted this through aggressive marketing, often targeting kids as well, that it just has become a cultural norm. We've accepted that as a norm, but there's really little nutritional value, especially if you compare it with eating fruit. And there's plenty of ways to get more whole foods into the diet that would have better benefits. And juice packs just as much sugar as soda, sometimes more, and definitely often more fructose than soda. So the minor nutritional benefits that might come with juice are hugely overwhelmed by the excess sugars that are coming in, and you can easily get the same benefits from whole fruits.
Yeah. Emily, you mentioned a few minutes ago about, actually I think you both have in this conversation, about making substitutions for everyday foods in the home that can help a family shift in a lower sugar direction. Can you give some examples of what sorts of substitutions a family might make, or
Sure.
Yeah.
So just anything that you can do to where, the sugar isn't already incorporated into your daily staples makes a big difference. So one example would be yogurt. A lot of families buy yogurt. If you buy a vanilla yogurt or a fruit flavored yogurt, the added sugar is already mixed in, and it is, unless you also buy plain yogurt and mix it together, not in too much control over how much sugar your kids are getting. And one serving of that fruit flavored yogurt can easily have like between 3 and 4, sometimes even 5 teaspoons of added sugar, which can easily also be the amount of added sugar that we're recommending for kids for the entire day as maximum. However, if you buy plain yogurt, you can top it with fresh fruit. You can even put a little, touch of honey or maple syrup at first while your kids get used to the more tart flavor. But the point being is that you're really more in control of how much added sugar your kids are getting.
Another simple example would be just to take, look at daily staples. Let's say peanut butter, for example, popular kids item. Many brands have added sugar in it, which you don't need. Just look for a brand that doesn't have added sugar, and you can eliminate a daily source of added sugar, and 99% of the time your kids won't even notice the difference.
Right. Also bread. you know, some of these whole wheat breads have like 3 grams of sugar, even 4 grams of sugar per slice, which is almost a teaspoon. And, you know, if you're just with one sandwich, that's two teaspoons of sugar right there. And the bread doesn't even really taste that sweet. So it's not, you know, it's not maybe apparent that that's a sweetened product. But if you can find a bread that doesn't have added sugar, save a lot of extra sugar that way.
Yeah. I like you mentioned a teaspoon, because, you know, it is how we talk about sugar sometimes. And what's great about that is that you can visualize it too, right? There's the activity that some folks will do, and I've done a few times with kids, where you actually measure out the teaspoons of sugar that are in a bottle of soda or in something, and it's really, really amazing to see that you've got this cup full of sugar that you just scooped out.
Right.
Yeah. Any other sorts of creative ways that you would suggest families can talk to kids about this? Because actually, I think that's probably one hang up that a lot of us parents, I'll include myself in this, might have about talking to kids about sugar and nutrition, is that trying to walk the line of making them aware and helping them make healthy choices while also not imposing too much guilt or shame, or not creating an eating issue down the road. How can parents walk that line? You know, what would a conversation look like in your mind?
Well, I'll take the first part, and then I'll hand it over to Emily. I mean, I think the key that we talk about is finding the internal motivation, and what's motivating your kids might be different to what your motivations as a parent might be. So there's that internal motivation is very different from an external motivation, which could be, you know, money or a prize or something like that, which is not going to work in the long term, because you don't want to be stuck paying your kid every day to not eat sugar.
Yeah.
But if you can talk to them using the technique of motivational interviewing that we talk about in the book, which is a technical term, just basically how to talk to your kid to dig around so that they have the space to express what their concerns are and what's motivating them, whether that's having better skin or fitting into a new pair of jeans or being able to run faster on the soccer field or whatever. If you can explore with them and find out common ground, a factor that's internally motivating them, then I think you'll have much better success. And that internal motivation could also be, something social, like the food industry is taking advantage of us, and I'm not going to stand for that. So it could also be kind of an upstander type motivating factor too. You just got to find out what that is, and there's ways to talk to kids about that Emily can talk a bit more about, probably using behavioral strategies in the home.
Yeah, and I think also just, you know, taking a small step back it's really something that I think is important to focus not just on what we're taking out, but what we're adding in. So trying to just cultivate in your children an enjoyment of picking out fresh fruits and vegetables, helping prepare them, getting excited about new recipes, and getting involved in the kitchen and in the garden. And I think sometimes that just sort of naturally shifts the conversation away from, you know, we shouldn't be having this or we shouldn't be having that, but let's have this. It's so great, you know, really like it, and it's also healthy. So just small things like maybe having a small windowsill garden with some herbs and growing some mint and making a fresh mint tea with that, and having it either hot or iced. My kids really like to do that. Or just progressively as they get older, there's things they can help with more in the kitchen. Young kids can kind of explore vegetables and shell beans or husk corn, or, you know, do fun things like that. It's like a play kind of sensory experience, but it's also familiarizing them with fruits and vegetables. Snapping asparagus is a really fun one. And then as kids get older, they enjoy operating the food processor, with the help of a parent, or starting to cut things and arrange them on platters and serving them. And it ties back in with some of what you've talked about in your previous podcasts, you and Monica, about socialization and, building independent skills that are lifelong skills that benefit children, not just in terms of nutrition, but also in terms of their, social skills.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, one thing that I think folks may be curious about is if they do feel like they see, if they have the sense that sugar may be at the root for mood swings and behavior changes and that sort of thing, do you think that substituting out some of these just everyday staples may be enough to see a shift? What can people look for? I know every kid's going to be different, and a response might be different, but because we know that making dietary changes requires a lot of investment, time, energy, money, emotional investment, and that's why various diet books and such are often hot sellers, because they have, all right, here's your fixed amount of time. And you guys do offer 7-day and 20-day challenges in the book. Do you think that folks can expect that within those 7 days or 28 days that they can see some big changes in their family?
Yeah, that's been our experience. So we road tested those plans in a number of different families and got a lot of great feedback related to clear changes. So you will see obvious changes in energy levels and temperament and things like that. Although I'm not going to, the first few days of taking out sugar on our 7-day plan might be rough, probably will be rough, but we have strategies for that too. But what will emerge is potentially a very different temperament in yourself and in your kids. And I think there's very noticeable effects. Emily can talk to kind of some specific examples of that, but also the research shows that under the skin, there's advantages too, even after 7 days of getting off sugar, that you can see metabolic improvements in blood pressure, in fatty liver, in risk for diabetes and heart disease. So you can definitely, even after 7 days, dial those things back. And you can dial back that sweet taste preference as well, for sure, and reset the taste palate. So there's definitely advantages. Now, it's not going to solve all the problems, and we don't expect you to stay off sugar forever, but it will definitely help identify the sources of sugar, identify substitutes, and see what the benefits might be. And you may have to repeat that periodically, which we do in our house. Let's say after the holiday season or after the summer holidays, or whenever there's been like a major binge on sugar, you can kind of dial that back with a 7-day plan. But Emily might want to talk about a few specific examples.
Definitely. So in the book, we talk about the sugar roller coaster, which is, when your child has sugar, especially first thing in the morning, they board this roller coaster of highs and lows of, big spike in energy followed by a crash. And that just fuels another cycle of craving sugar and going through that again. And that can easily last the whole day. So what we've seen is that through these challenges, or just through simple shifts in family habits, you can see quick changes in energy levels and concentration, and even more evenness of temperament as well, just by changing breakfast. That's a big one. So families that were, used to serving things like juice or toaster waffles with syrup out of convenience, realize that if they make a little bit more of an investment in, planning ahead, maybe making something the night before that can be eaten quickly, but that is higher in protein and lower in sugar, it actually ends up saving a lot of time. It might not seem like it at first, but especially now that a lot of us have our kids home doing distance learning, with COVID, you'll see that if you take the time to make your kids a better breakfast, that you won't also be spending as much time mid-morning dealing with, lack of focus, lack of concentration, hunger, irritability, asking for more snacks, whininess, those kind of things.
And what would a better breakfast look like? What would you suggest?
Well, it's, it really depends on the family and the kid. I try and go savory completely with my kids when possible. So, something like scrambled eggs with spinach, or one of my sons really likes smoked salmon. So he'll have smoked salmon on this kind of buckwheat chia bread that we make that is really high fiber. One of my kids really does like porridge, so we'll do steel-cut oats that we simmer with dates, a couple dates, just to sweeten it without adding something like honey or maple syrup after. Those usually work well in my house.
But it can also be a very simple hack. So coming down to something as simple as what do you put on your toast, or what you put on your pancakes, or adding a bit more fiber into the batter, or using something that's non-sugary as a topping. Right. And we have hundreds of different ideas, and I'll issue a challenge right now to your listeners. Because breakfast is such an important part of this whole story, and it could be a very simple hack. So email us your breakfast and we'll fix your breakfast. And that doesn't mean to say we're going to send you off on some different path with a whole set of different recipes or whatever. It could be a very simple fix. Like, okay, if your kids are fixed on breakfast cereal, for example, it could be just helping identify a different breakfast cereal, or gradually weaning off the breakfast cereal, or choosing a low sugar breakfast cereal but serving it with fruit. Studies show that that's equally as acceptable to young kids and increases the nutrient density. So we'll fix your breakfast. Send us your breakfast and let us know what the concern is, and I'm sure that with a simple hack, it can be tweaked to reduce some sugar.
I think folks will take you up on that. Where should they send the email?
Fill my inbox. I'd love it. Yeah. Hello@sugarproofkids.com.
Cool. I'll have it in the show notes for the page too. How else should people find you? How can they connect and learn more?
Well, we have the website, sugarproofkids.com. There's quite a bit of information on there. We've posted some of the recipes from the book, some new recipes that Emily's developing all the time. All of the science is on there. That's sugarproofkids.com. On Instagram and Facebook, our handle is @sugarproofkids. And we're posting daily tips, recommendations, recipes, and so on there as well.
Yeah, and it really is some great content. We got hooked up not too long ago, and I've been following you since then, and find that there is some really useful information there. So I definitely encourage folks to follow you on Instagram and to pick up the book, Sugarproof: The Hidden Dangers of Sugar That Are Putting Your Child's Health at Risk and What You Can Do. There it is. Perfect. And, I often have one final question that I like to ask guests that come on the show. And it's been really interesting over the years to see what folks will say. Sometimes there are common threads, but there are also very different answers. And usually I would ask for 3 pieces of advice to help parents raise happy, healthy, confident kids. But perhaps since we have 2 of you today, if you each have 2 that you might want to share, what would you say?
Do you want to go first, Emily?
Why don't you start?
Yeah. Although we'll do tag team. We'll do one each.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's slightly off topic, but it is somewhat related. And we, eating together is important in our house. Breakfast can be difficult because of schedules these days, but we like to eat dinner together. I think eating dinner together is so important. Yeah. And we do gratefulness most of the time at dinner. So I think that helps kind of connect to the food as well, because often the gratefulness gets connected to the food and where it came from, who grew it, who cooked it, and I think it's just a great kind of bonding experience, especially today with kids being stressed about so many different things. I have 2 teenagers, and their life is turned upside down right now. So connecting over food with gratefulness check-ins, I think, is being helpful for that.
That's great.
Yeah, following on along that too is just involving kids in the discussion, not just about sugar, but about food in general, and raising them to be more aware and then just also more capable of making their own decisions.
Yeah. Dr. Emily Ventura and Dr. Michael Goran, thank you both so much for being here today. This has been phenomenal.
Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed talking with you, and I'm so glad we made the connection to you, and loved talking with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been a really fun chat.
Absolutely.